also play music, and one of the things I like to do at my talks is bring weird musical instruments to play. And this is one that I've been bringing to my talks a lot because I can sneak it on carry-on. Ooh, nice high-frequency feedback. And I'm actually going to use this as a point of reference for my talk. This is an instrument called, from Laos. It's called a can. Huh. Let's see, you want me closer probably, but well, I'll try. All right, so here's a little bit of what the can sounds like. I'm not playing in a traditional style, you ought to be able to guess, although it's not that far from what you hear. There's a particular reason that I choose this instrument, aside from the fact that I can sneak it on carry-on for talks about digital stuff. And the reason why is that, so far as I can tell, this is the earliest historical instance of digital information. This is the oldest device made by people that has a parallel set of objects that are turned either off or on. It's much older than the abacus, and it's older than any markings in Babylon. Or, sorry, I'm not totally awake, so I got the wrong ancient culture there, but it doesn't matter. Anyway, we have pretty good evidence these are about 13,000 years old and probably much older. They're a wonderful, mysterious folk craft. There are two dissertations I know of where people made simulations of the acoustics that were not entirely definitive. I once had a very pleasant afternoon with the physicist Richard Feynman taking one apart, trying to understand exactly how it worked. And what's lovely is theory hasn't quite caught up with practice still after all these thousands of years. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, so if this is the origin of digital information, and this conference is about the future of it, I want to use this as my guide for a couple of topics. Let's start with the problem of ambient information access. Specifically, that you hear music even if you don't intend to, if you're near it. Music spreads around. So once again, going to the ancient world, there's a garbage dump that's being uncovered with old Greek sort of tabloid writing. And a lot of it is porn, wonderful old stuff. But there's a joke book that somebody found, and one of the jokes in it was that if you play the musicians in the agora 1 drachma, they'll play music, and if you play them 2, they'll stop playing. Which is a joke that is still very common in the musical world today. And so it has this ancient origin. And that points out to the fact that there was already ambient information overload with the invention of the first digital information, with the earliest instruments. Even earlier than this, one of my favorite old artifacts that I haven't been able to handle in person, although I've seen it, but there's a 75,000-year-old Neanderthal hewn flute. And if you play a casting of it, it actually plays in tune. So you have this incredible ancient history of music, and undoubtedly in Neanderthal times, somebody was playing this flute and somebody else nearby threw a rock at the player. There's almost no question that happened. So the problem we're going to face that's related to this old joke about the drachma and the agora is that with augmented reality, there's going to be a tension between seeing too little and seeing too much. And that's what I view as the fundamental design mystery to be solved. So that is to say, let's suppose that you have very few opposing channels of virtual world content, so that most people, when they look at augmentation, see about the same thing. Well, then there'll be a problem of them seeing too much. There'll be a problem of a world becoming overloaded. And then conversely, if there are a great many channels, so that few people see the same things, there'll be this problem of the world breaking into bubbles that are ever more separate from each other. Now, the world breaking into bubbles is approximately what's happening online today, where the particular business models that are popular and the particular social software models that are popular have tended to create worlds where people see information that's personalized for them by algorithms, meaning that they tend to see different information than other people, meaning that they enter into a feedback loop where what the algorithm thinks about them influences who they really become over time. And that leads to a world that I think is ever more separated. And I think it has a little bit to do with the particular style of craziness in recent American politics, for instance. And I'm a little concerned about it. But aside from that, it also sort of undercuts the whole point of the internet, because what it's doing is it's recreating television stations. It's creating a simulation of the old system of a few television stations where people just sort of tune into a particular curated point of view. Now, hypothetically, because these algorithms are calculating different points of view for each person, you might think there'd be a dispersion of many, many different points of view that are calculated in that way, rather than a simulation of television. But what actually tends to happen is that it simulates the television system of just a few channels, and the reason why is just commercial motivation. That the way the thing is set up, the services that provide information on the internet tend to make the real money from third parties who pay for additional access to people, special access through link ads and that sort of thing. And the more that people are corralled into a smaller number of categories, the more value that service can have. And the reason for that, in turn, is that the algorithms that determine who people are and what they want to see aren't perfect, because we don't actually understand how the brain works and all that. So this little gap between what the algorithms can really do and reality is closed by narrowing reality, if you see what I mean. So, and I should say, as I'm sure I don't need to say to this audience, but when I speak about such things, I'm not in any remote sense speaking for Microsoft, but just for myself. And if you want to read more about that, I have a book about those sorts of ideas called You Are Not a Gadget. But anyway, back to augmented reality. The problem I see for augmented reality is that we have to come up with a user interface design that gives us an ambient form of notification of augmentations that are available that is functional, unobtrusive, attractive, seductive, fun enough for everybody to buy into universally, so that they have at least a window into a variety of augmentations all the time, rather than having an entry point to what augmentations there are that's pre-filtered. And that's a very, very interesting problem. It's a problem that isn't solved for conventional computing. You really don't get to see what your neighbor sees on either Google or Facebook or anything. There isn't really a solution for that. With augmentation, I think the solution might actually come more easily. And I want to talk about why. One of the interesting features of information is that it's largely free. And this goes back to this idea that information wants to be free, which was uttered by Stuart Brand at one point as part of a larger phrase. We also said it, but sometimes it wants to be expensive. The second part is often forgotten. We should remember that the reason information wants to be free is the idea that it can be infinitely copied, and it's only scarcity that accrues value in a market. Now, the idea that information should be copied a lot might seem inevitable, or inherent to information technology, but in fact it was alien at first. And I'd like to just recover a little bit of the history for you. The first description of the internet, which got as far as describing approximately what we have today with Facebook and Skype and all these things, would have been written a little over 100 years ago by Ian Forster, and that's called The Machine Stops. How many people have read that? How many people haven't read it? Okay, well, your assignment is to go read The Machine Stops, because this is just really a wild thing. What happened is that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, there was an active debate going on among the public intellectuals of the time, and this led to the birth of a great many things that were quite influential. It directly led, the debate was about what the role of people will be when technology gets really good. Will people be made obsolete? What'll happen? And the considerations of that question led to the birth of communism. That's what motivated Karl Marx very directly. It led to the birth of science fiction. It led to a lot of the sort of idea spectrum we have in modernity. So H.G. Wells had offered one vision of what would happen, an example being the novel The Time Machine, where when technology gets really good, only a few people aren't made obsolete. So basically the hackers and the people who are close to the big servers they bifurcate into this other species, and everybody else just is kind of wallowing out in the world and reverts to sort of barbarism. And the interesting thing about H.G. Wells' vision is that he saw it as demeaning and as a negative outcome for both populations, which I think was certainly correct. Marx looked at exactly the same problem and said, well, at some point when the machines get good enough to do a whole lot of the jobs that people might get paid for, we need to have a socialist party that just takes care of everybody. And the problem with that is that if you go down that road, it means some socialist party has to decide what's really good for everybody. And Marx was amazingly explicit about it. At one point in his writings, he talks about how after the revolution, we will all relax in manicured lawns and practice archery and read the classics. Which doesn't sound all that bad, but what if that's not your thing? And there you have the problem with Marx, is that if you don't happen to be into archery or the classics, you're screwed. Or if you prefer like desert landscaping or something. So so you had better like what the socialist ideal is at the time, or you're screwed. And the problem with this debate is that there was a paucity of good solutions. Every path proposed seemed to kind of lead to some kind of unhappy outcome. Ian Forster wrote the short story in part as a pastiche of H.G. Wells. And in this story, he envisions a remarkably mature internet as we know it today, complete with social networking, as I say, and video calls and all sorts of things. And the users tend to live in these little hive-like modules and just interact through the screens. It's exaggerated, it's a dystopia. And at the end, there's this catastrophe where the internet breaks down, which is the machine stopping. And like the survivors of this horrible event sort of crawl out, the sun, the beautiful world. And so the first thing is that Ian Forster's work is the very most impressive in terms of prescience, because he got so much right many decades before Turing even. I mean, it's just astounding he was able to do it. Way, way before anybody else had a vision of how this thing could be. So that's incredibly impressive. But his outcome was also really kind of unsatisfactory. It's the fallacy of Rousseau, that something about modern technology makes life meaningless and mechanical, and that we should go back to earlier times when things were really better. And the problem with that is that if you really look at what earlier times were like, when there was less technology, they really sucked badly. I'm not a technological utopian in the sense that I don't think improving technology automatically betters things, but I think that improving technology is an absolutely necessary, though insufficient, part of making the world better. People also have to make good moral and ethical use of the technology, or it's for naught. But without improved technology, you don't even have the wiggle room to become more decent. We forget how incredibly wretched most lives were the further back in time you go. How many people had to endure being slaves, how many babies died before even having a chance to become children, how many people suffered under horrible diseases, just how drudgerous and filthy and smelly life was, and cruel. We forget all that. So Forster, even though Forster is the sort of most feel-good, and he's kind of like the most Oprah-like of the early conversants here, it's really an unsatisfying outcome. So far as I know, the first person to come up with a fresh answer to this question is a guy named Ted Nelson. How many people have heard of Ted Nelson? Well, that's pretty good. It's kind of shocking, though, that many of you haven't. So now we're zooming up to 1960. Ted Nelson is kind of an odd character. He's still alive. He lives in a houseboat in Sausalito. By nature, he's a little bit like a Kerouac type of figure, sort of a beatniky figure maybe, or a hippie. Hollywood parents, and he fell in with the digital crowd. His mentor was Doug Engelbart, who pioneered productivity software, invented the mouse and word processing and a bunch of other stuff. And in 1960, way early, I mean, this is even before most of Marshall McLuhan's cool books and stuff, he proposed a structure for what we now think of the internet and the web. And the interesting thing about his proposal is it's very similar to what we have. Instead of URLs, he had something called a Tumblr, but very similar. He had a very similar structure. He didn't fully understand what a packet switch network would be. He didn't understand that computer graphics would be possible. That wasn't invented yet. That would only happen a few years later with Ivan Sutherland. So in a sense, it's very primitive. But the structure he came up with was the structure one would come up with if what was thinking about was the unresolved dialogue of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And here's what his idea was. On this network of the future, people can put up information. At the time, he was only thinking about text, as I said, because computer graphics hadn't been invented, but whatever, information. And it never needs to be copied again, because it's a network. Why would you copy it? It's stupid to copy it. I mean, it's true, you might have to make local caches here and there to make the thing run quickly, but from a logical point of view, there'd be no reason to copy it. And once you realize that there's no longer any need to copy things fundamentally, a whole new idea about the future of humanity arises from that simple insight. And that is that each person can own and be responsible for and tend some information on what today we'd call their own local server or virtual server or something. And other people can make references to it in order to aggregate bigger and bigger things. So for instance, one person might put up a photograph, someone else incorporates the photograph in a blog, someone else incorporates the blog in a larger magazine product, which then becomes the basis for a script that's acted by actors or whatever. There's like a chain of reference, and because there's only one copy, and because the whole thing is automated, you can maintain a genuinely universal micropayment system where absolutely everybody is a first-class citizen in the world of information. Anybody can put something up, make some money from it. Now, the reason this vision, even though it was the first vision of the internet, is radically different from the options we're used to in our regular discussions these days, and you have to sometimes go through a bit of a double take and a figure ground reversal to sort of get how profound it is. So let me approach this from a couple of other angles. One of the first things to say is that it's crucial that there only be one universal store, one universal login, one universal point of exchange, as opposed to multiple ones like the Apple Store or the Amazon Store. And the reason for that, which Ted articulated very early, was the limits of human cognition. That any system like this would require some sort of login ability. And how many logins can people remember? Nobody's going to remember 1 million. Nobody's going to remember 50, maybe a few of us, and maybe the special population in this room, some of us could hit 50. Most people will be like 7 plus or minus 2 or something like that, at the very most. And for a lot of people, it'll be like 3 or 2 or 1. And so the problem is, when you have an artificial limit of that kind, the market will eventually turn into a few giants, once again creating network television. And so there really should be one universal one, with the metaphor being a single currency, a single national army, a single court system, that sort of thing. Like, it's just one of those things where a unitary structure makes sense. It seems at first as though having more stores creates diversity, but in fact, because of the reality of human cognition, just the reverse happens. You end up with a few big players. So it's better to just have one universal one that can be guided by a democratic process, because it's not the crucial function. It's just an accounting mechanism, ultimately. Now, another crucial angle on understanding Ted's idea is the idea of a social contract. And here, the question is, how does civilization run? Like, why don't all of us just right now, this is Silicon Valley, there are a lot of people with valuables in their cars parked in the parking lot, probably all kinds of like iPads, all kinds of little goodies. Why don't we all just go out there and break into the cars? I have a feeling there are a lot of hackers in this room who know how to hack a lock or two. I certainly do. Why don't we just go do it? Well, the reason why is not so much that we fear getting caught, although that there's a factor there, but we're pretty smart, we can probably get away with it. The ultimate reason why is enlightened self-interest. It's that we want to live in a world where that sort of thing just doesn't happen a lot. We like the idea that when we come home, nobody's broken into our houses, usually, and the same thing for our cars. We just like that world better, so we live in that world. It's called a social contract. And that fundamental idea that you buy into a set of constraints on behavior, not because you're forced to, but because it's to your benefit, because it's a good idea overall, because it makes you happier, more relaxed, it makes sense for everybody. That is civilization. And so what Ted realized is that if there was a network information system that benefited everybody, they'd also buy into it. It would be a new form of civilization. And so making everyone an absolute first-class citizen without having to worry about an intermediary getting in a particular store if they were going to be crunched was absolutely critical to getting to that point. He called his invention Hypermedia. Hyper, of course, being similar to meta, but also meaning sort of like wired and excited. The term cyber showed up just a little later. Somebody else coined that. That comes from an ancient idea of navigation. And well, I know actually came up earlier. That was from, sorry, I'm just not awake. I'm not remembering my names. I'll remember in a second. But anyway, so cyber and hyper were the two sort of guiding ideas here. Ted, unfortunately, was, by sort of presenting himself as a countercultural figure, I think he made himself a little hard to understand, a little harder to understand, because what he had to get across was a very radical idea, and I think very, very few people got it. Even today, it's hard to get it across. And I say this with all the love and affection in my heart, but he was the world's worst manager. And I might be the world's second worst. I've learned enough to try to avoid, I've learned enough about myself to try to avoid being in a position of being a manager, but Ted was genuinely the worst, where he gathered a collection of collaborators or followers who would be very 60s-like and live in communes and whatnot, and were always on the verge of transforming the world, but always having doctrinal splits and arguments about what the one true path would be, and of course never shipped. And it was so frustrating. But the thing about Ted's work is that it was the first vision, and everything that came later, all of the world of networking that we know, actually was after Ted's idea, had to differentiate it from Ted. Ted's stuff was out there, and it wasn't he was a sort of a countercultural figure, but he was talking to real people, and he was around the real institutions, and you couldn't just dismiss it. So in early days, there were arguments about why Ted's stuff was wrong, and they're really fascinating. I remember very well Ted speaking to something called the Homebrew Club that used to meet at Stanford. How many people have heard of that? God, it's amazing how history doesn't survive even in this age of information systems. So, the Homebrew Club transformed computing into a bipolar thing instead of a monopolar thing. Before the Homebrew Club, computing came from on high, from big government labs and the Defense Department and the major universities with funding from those guys. The Homebrew Club was a little club where people would make their own computers, and they would run around Silicon Valley grabbing little prototype chips, little crappy chips, and making unbelievably crappy little devices, like the first ones. And I remember being so excited about these. You could flip little switches for bits, and you could watch little lights that would show you how the bits were set, and you could run a program and it would kind of like churn. And that was all you could do. That was the I/O of the thing. And we were like, oh my God, we built a computer. We were so excited. These little tiny crappy things. But that hobbyist movement is what launched Apple and Microsoft and all these other early companies that became giants. And it totally transformed the system into a bipolar system where there was both a bottom-up and a top-down dynamic. And that's the world we live in today, where we both have little startups that become big like Facebook, and we have the top-down legacy people like the AT&Ts, and there's this tension between them. So that world was born at this little club. So I remember Ted showing up at the club, and the stage being stormed by Maoists, or people call themselves Maoists. I mean, of course, they were suburban American Maoists, but they were like, we're watching you, and they used horrible obscenities. Fucktard wasn't invented yet. I think that was Fake Steve, but it was like something like "you fucking shithead" or something like that. And they were like, and the phrase they used is a really interesting one. They said, the purpose of we didn't have the word internet yet, but it was like, it was just called computers. The purpose is not to further capitalism, it's to starve the beast. And of course, now when you hear the term starve the beast, we associate it with the Tea Party movement and the idea of starving government by not allowing taxes to match expenditures. But at that time, starve the beast meant making information free so as to force humanity down the path that Marx wanted, where people would be gradually dependent more and more on a communist party. And I remember them shouting him down so he couldn't speak at all, and at the end the only words he could get out were "fuck you too," and stormed off. And that was like the early debate about the internet, a really different one than the one we think of today. There were a lot of other factors that came into play. The top-down people had certain ideas about it, where they wanted all security and sort of an elitist approach to it. There was also this fantasy. The leftist fantasy, though, was the incredible driver of the bottom-up one. There was this sort of notion that, remember, this was the time when a lot of people were dodging the draft. If you went to the early labs related to the internet at universities, or like the Stanford AI lab in particular, I remember, were basically pot gardens. And everyone was afraid of being busted. And then if you were sort of more of a red stater, you were afraid of getting busted for speeding, and you were using your CB radio a little later in the 70s and to sort of evade the cops. And there was this general paranoia that everybody needs to be sort of anonymous, and that the big thing is that you don't want to get caught, you want to be able to hide yourself. And so that factor was probably the thing that really killed the TED approach more than anything else, this sort of paranoia. Because obviously in Ted's world, you're responsible for your data, so you're not like just sort of hiding and putting stuff out there anonymously. And there were a lot of early structures. How many of you know what Usenet is? How many don't know what Usenet is? Oh, okay, so you know more. It's kind of interesting to see what people know about. So Usenet, which is still kind of chugging along, was the pre-web thing that, well, one of the pre-web things that had some traction as a shared point of media distribution on the net. And it very early on got this sort of the .alt thing that John Gilmore started, which was sort of like this very anonymous, where you could post weird stuff and porn and everything, which quickly overwhelmed the servers at all the national labs, the porn flood. So that's kind of how Ted's ideas got obscured. Now, there's another side to what killed Ted's ideas, which is a really funny one, which is a little unheralded. So if we move to the late 60s and then especially into the 70s, starting in 68 and then especially as we get into the mid-70s, there was an enormously influential lab called Xerox Parc, which some of us visited the other day. And Xerox Parc had a team run, in particular the team run by Alan Kay, that pretty much invented what conventional computers look like these days, with like icons and a graphic interface. Ted drew a cartoon in 1972 of some kids using a little tablet and touching the screen that really looks a lot like an iPad. And they were the first people to do user interfaces with the actual pixels on the screen instead of vector graphics. So it was like very pioneering work. And key people in all the other companies that worked in this, like Apple, had started at Parc, Larry Tesler in particular. Anyway, the thing about Xerox Parc that's like one of the tragic ironies of history is that its sponsor company was Xerox. And the most famous problem with this is that Xerox was absolutely unable to integrate what the hell they had. And there's a book called Fumbling the Future about what incredible morons they were. It was like the guy who turned down the Beatles because guitar bands were going out or something at Decca. Xerox said, oh, who wants all this like consumer computing stuff? You know, a lot of you, what are you wasting your money for? And then of course this giant thing happens. There was early on when I got to know Larry Tesser, I remember this funny moment when they suddenly realized, oh, this thing's taking off. And this was well before the Mac, of course. They said, we better try to buy this Apple thing. And between the time when they decided they wanted to buy Apple, and they'd gone through all the meetings to actually make an offer, Apple's value had expanded so much they could no longer afford it, just in that interval. So they were totally unprepared for this extraordinary world that they had actually funded the launch of. So it's one of the great stories of corporate failure. But there's another interesting failure involved that is less heralded, which is when Parc got started, Ted's ideas were still very much in currency. And the starting point, as you recall, is that if you have a network, you don't really need to copy things, because it's a network. You can just keep on accessing stuff. And there were many arguments for that. I just presented the sort of socioeconomic future argument. I should mention the global warming argument. The internet is a giant machine distributed everywhere with a huge carbon footprint. We don't know how big it is, because a lot of it's in secret server farms. But just BitTorrent moving around pirated movies is more than half of the bit traffic. So we're just like spewing all this carbon because of a really stupid architecture. And it certainly seems unconscionable to me. But leaving that aside, imagine being at Xerox Parc, desperately trying to figure out how do we tell these sick corporate headquarters of Xerox that this is the future? How do we get through their thick heads? And then you're trying to come up with some way to pitch it. And they had all these meetings where they were trying different ways to communicate it. And they never quite penetrated because it was just too alien at the time. Now imagine somebody says, oh, we should also mention to them that the whole idea of copying is now obsolete. You know? And it's like, okay, now just give up. Like just bomb the lab and go home. Nothing's left. So essentially, this weird coincidence of sponsorship absolutely buried the very simple observation that copying is stupid when you have a network, or unnecessary copying. Local caching, as I say, for efficiency is a different question, but logical copying is actually a dumb operation. So anyway, what happened is, as a result of all these things, we ended up with sort of a bizarre inherited dogma in which we can't see the obvious anymore. There are many other examples of this in computer science history. This is just one. Anyway, getting back to augmented reality, if I do remember it really. If it's the case that the scarcity of something has to do with its value, then a file in a network that's architected around making copies has no intrinsic value. And that's why people try to put up paywalls or something to sort of enforce a little bit of scarcity or inconvenience on it. Now let's consider augmented reality, because the value of an augmentation, well, not all augmentations. Some augmentations you could sort of experience anywhere. All it needs is you. But most of the interesting augmentations will in some way relate to something about the physical world, because otherwise why even bother, right? So they'll be attached to a person, a place, or a thing, or an animal, or whatever. Or the sky at night, whatever it might be. There'll be some physical reference point. And as soon as you have a cross between the information artifact and the physical artifact, the information artifact inherits a bit of the scarcity of the physical artifact. Meaning, if there's an augmentation that really benefits from being had at the Statue of Liberty, suddenly there's a value to actually doing it at the Statue of Liberty. You can certainly simulate being at the Statue of Liberty, but there'll always be this increment if the augmentation is done well. So augmentation brings back scarcity into information systems. And you can, depending on your point of view, you can say, oh, that's horrible. Doesn't that mean that it's now sort of imposing a kind of barrier, making it harder for people to enjoy things? Or you can say, wow, this is a chance to rethink Ted's old ideas. And of course, that latter is where I'm going with it. That's what I think is kind of exciting. So the notion that you might be able to find a way to augment something and have that augmentation have an intrinsic scarcity to it because that it inherits from the physical world, suddenly creating all kinds of new commerce models that you didn't have before. That really intrigues me. Now I want to emphasize, the only way this is to the benefit of everybody is if there's you have to have the whole cycle of Ted's thinking in play here. If all you do is you say, well, this information, it isn't free, but if you pay for it, you don't have any way of benefiting yourself. You have to be a first-class citizen and have a way of benefiting from what you do or the way you support other people who do augmentations or something in order for you to be happy to pay for it. It has to be a first-class citizen social contract or else it doesn't work. And how to get there, of course, is a whole other big question. But anyway, getting back to the problem of annoyance in the Agora, relating to ancient music, what we need to have is a user interface that becomes widely accepted, in which people are able to have notifications about available augmentations, even if there are a whole lot of them, that somehow don't impede them or don't take up so much of their consciousness as to harm their performance or annoy them. I don't know if that user interface is possible, but I suspect it is. I suspect it is because all of modernity kind of has that same quality. Just being in a city is a little like that. It's a world of compromises. I don't think that this UI will be designed by a single company or a single person. I think it'll have to evolve through a lot of empirical torture, a lot of hard times, but I think we'll get there. So let's suppose we have this world where you have some sort of a notification system. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's something you wear, something in your pocket, whether it connects to your brain directly or what. There are a whole bunch of gadget ideas, and of course that's a world I love, but let's suppose we have that. And now, going along, you get a notification, you're in the lobby of this hotel, and you get a notification that there have been hundreds of interesting augmentations. They might be presented to you in the usual ways that things are ranked. Maybe there's even an algorithm that guesses what you like the most. Maybe there's popularity contests. Maybe there's professional reviewers, just all that stuff, whatever. You have hopefully some way that doesn't separate you from what other people see. Hopefully some way that you can see at least the range of what somebody else who has a very different history online might see when they walk into the same lobby. And let's say you go up to something, and what it is it's maybe it's a cumulative check-in object where everybody who's come has left some little treat, some sort of Christmas tree-like thing where each person can leave a little thing saying who's been here before, like a cross between Foursquare and gold hunting or something like that. And you leave something that's really cool, and what you know is that as other people enjoy it and maybe copy it themselves, you'll start earning a few pennies along your way. But things that don't earn sort of gradually fade, maybe so that the world doesn't immediately absolutely fill to the brim with crap. These are hard problems, I'm the first to admit that. But that kind of a world seems to me to be a very beneficial one. Now, a scenario, I have a feeling about how it's going to come about, which is that there's going to be a competition between adding more and more computation to the physical world as opposed to augmenting a less instrumented physical world, or less apparently augmented physical world. So one example of that is that display technology is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So it's quite easy to foresee a time in the not too distant future at all where every damn surface of a wall when you walk in is going to be covered in displays, kind of like in Las Vegas, and then there'll be a reaction against that, where, it's like, oh my God, it's just too much. The floor is a display, there's advertising and there's all this stuff, and you walk into the display and it simulates a tropical island beach one moment, then it's something else, and you're like, let me out of this. So what I think is actually going to happen is that augmentation, in a sense, in the big picture, is going to be part of a reaction against over-instrumenting the real world. And the only reason I say that, it's a kind of interesting, there's a competition in terms of the technology and the price points of various kinds of real-world modifications versus augmentations. And it's kind of interesting, like we talked about one of them last night. I think there's going to be a contest between cars that drive themselves and augmenting drivers. So one or the other must happen because we kill so many of each other in car accidents. My mom was killed in a car accident, and the toll of of car accidents is so extreme that it just outpaces wars, terrorism, a great many diseases. It's just a horror. So we have to fix it. I mean, it's an absolute imperative, non-negotiable to fix that. There are all kinds of other advantages. Oh, by the way, Tish, tell me when I should stop, because I have no...
Talking to Blaze, I was thinking, because otherwise you might get behind for the day.
Should I stop soon?
I could listen to this all day.
No, just tell me, it's fine.
I think we better move on just because I know we have to at some point.
I have no idea how long I've been talking. I can just go. Usually somebody has a clock in front of me, like, oh, I better stop.
No, I like to.
All right, so I'll wind up really soon. Okay, so anyway, so if you could optimize how cars moved around, you could save a lot of fuel because they could just merge cleanly instead of creating huge traffic jams. They wouldn't hit each other, so you wouldn't have to pay. You wouldn't have to pay for moving all this armor around. There are so many advantages. So there's two ways to do it. One is augmenting the drivers, and one is automating the cars. And what's interesting is that these two things are kind of converging, and there's going to be a contest. And I don't think we yet know which is the better solution. I think that the answer has to be based on the death toll, not anything else. And we'll know, like in 10 years we'll know. That's a really interesting one. But something similar will go on with just the contest between cheap displays everywhere and augmentations of a sort of a damped down world that's more retro. And I have a feeling that augmented reality will win that one. With the cars, I don't know. But with just general environments, I'm pretty sure augmented reality will win. And so, since I'm finishing now, I hope you realize what I've just made is an argument for how we'll take over the world and how there's a bright future for all this, and all of you will make tons of money. And, woo! And I guess that's enough. So, hey, thanks for listening to all this, and appreciate it.